Hello everyone, the 2023 State of CSS survey is currently open. If you don't know what the State of CSS survey is, it's a survey for CSS developers of all levels that allows to get an overview of how CSS is used and perceived. And this year I thought it might be a good idea to take it together so we can have a look and discuss the latest CSS features, probably discover new ones I don't know yet. If you want to try the survey on your side, I will leave the link in the description. It's available in plenty of languages. You will probably find yours, and there are other surveys available. The State of GraphQL, I don't take this one, but the State of JavaScript are surveys I like to take each year. So let's take the survey. If it's your first time, you can decide to continue as a guest, but as I have an account, I will enter my email address and get a magic link. So let's meet in the survey. So welcome to the survey. It wants me to take it in French, but I will turn it to English so it will be better for all of us. Great. I just noticed that there is a new feature this year. There's a reading list, and that's very nice because when you take the survey, you find things that seem interesting, but when you're done, it's never easy to come back to dig into it. So it seems that yes, you can click the plus icon here and it's added to your reading list and then you can delete it. Okay, perfect. So there are a few categories starting with layout. So let's have a look. And the first one is a subgrid. For each question, you need to tell if you have never heard of it, know what it is, but haven't used it or used it. You can even leave comments. So subgrids, I'm not sure, that's a very nice feature. I'm not sure it's well supported by the browsers yet. It's been supported by Firefox for a few times, but they were the only one. So that's a really nice feature. I think it will come to major browsers soon. So definitely that's something I've used, not in production because of the browser support, but that's very interesting. If you don't know subgrids, with CSS grids today, we define a grid at container level, which is a parent, and then we have children element that will be positioned inside the grid. With subgrid, descendants of the children can also be positioned inside of their parents' grid. That's a very brief shortcut, but that's the idea behind it. Okay, writing modes, of course, this is something I used, and this is part of the OxyProps framework. You have utility classes for that allows you to define the writing mode. You can find information in the documentation and the typography section of the documentation for that, with, of course, vertical or horizontal language. CSS logical properties, margin block, padding block. If you watch my videos, you hear me talk about this all the time. So yes, I've used it. It's been built in OxyProps from the beginning. And if you don't know CSS logical properties, instead of a margin left or a margin right, that usually makes sense for someone using a left to right language. If you want to add padding at the beginning of your text, you will add a padding left. But if you are writing in another language, an Arabic language, for example, with the right to left direction, this padding, you want it at the beginning of your text, so you want it on the right. So by defining a logical property, by defining padding in line start, in this case, you will always have your padding at the beginning of your text, regardless of your language direction. So that's the interest of the logical property. Okay, aspect ratio, of course, I've used it. It's part of the OxyProps framework. You have utility classes to define that. Content visibility. Okay, I've used it. I'm not using it in OxyProps framework. What is content visibility? Well, it's a CSS property that allows you, I would say it can be considered similar to a lazy loading. When you define your elements, you can assign a content visibility property, and with the auto value, for example, you will let the browser decide when the element will be loaded in the DOM. So you can set the visibility from memory to visible, to auto, or to hidden. If you set it to visible, it will always be visible, even if it's not in the view box of the screen. If you set it to auto, it will not be loaded until the browser thinks it will be useful for the user. So it's kind of lazy loading. And with the hidden, it never loads. There's a difference with setting a display none, for example, because if you set a display none, the content of your element is not visible in your document, but with content visibility, even if it's not yet visible in the viewport, it remains visible for search, for example. If you search content in your document, this content will be accessible even if it's not yet visible, which is not the case with the display none. For example, content will not be searchable. Flexbox gap, of course, I've used it. You have CSS properties and utility classes in the framework in OxyProps to define them. Container queries, I've used it. It's not yet available in OxyProps. I'm considering it, of course, and working on it for future versions. If you don't know yet what container queries are, you probably know media queries and breakpoints that allow you to define styles based on the screen dimensions. While with container queries, you can do similar things, but this time based on the parent container dimensions. So, for example, you can have an element on your screen that takes full width on a mobile, and then it expands, and when at sometimes you decide that your global layout will create a sidebar, and this element jumps to the sidebar, and actually its width will be smaller on a bigger screen than it was on a small screen. With container queries, you will be able to define a different layout for your element when its container size changes, what wasn't possible only with CSS previously. So that's very interesting. It's not yet available in OxyProps, but it will probably be available in the future. Object viewbox. Okay, what is this? Okay, I remember. Okay, so I know what it is. I haven't used it much. That's a new CSS property. I think it's quite recent, maybe from last year. And this allows you to crop an image directly from your CSS. You see that it defines an inset with the 4 parameters, and actually this defines how to say that, crop margins for all sides. So that's the idea. You have your image, and then you will, with the object viewbox, define for each of the sides of your image what is the percentage of crop on each side. Okay, I don't use it very much. That's not something that can be easily integrated in the framework. Of course, I cannot define any utility class for that because each case will have different values, but it's interesting to know about it because it can be useful for some use case. Small, large, and dynamic viewport unit. So, of course, I've used it. Currently, OxyProps framework use them, I would say, what's the word, sparingly? Not so much. It will be much more used in version 2 that is coming soon. If you don't know what these are dynamic viewport units. You probably know VW and VH as CSS unit. And this is mainly useful for mobiles because you know that on mobiles, you have parts of the operating system user interface that can come into view, like address bars or toolbars, and they reduce the effective viewport. So if you use VH unit for the viewport height, for example, to have your page full height and place items at the bottom, it might be invisible if a toolbar comes into view on your visitor's phone. If you use DVH in place of VH, this will be the dynamic viewport height, and this value will change when UI elements come into view. So by using DVH instead of VH, if you position an element at the bottom of your page, it will always remain visible because when the toolbars becomes visible, the DVH unit takes this into consideration and reduces its value. I hope I'm clear, but that's the idea. So that's very interesting, mainly for mobiles. I have no use case in mind for desktops. If you have some, please let me know in the comments. The media queries range context, okay, I use it. It's not directly visible in the framework. I use it in my source code, and then it's compiled, so it's not visible for you when you use OxyProps. But this allows for much more understandable media queries. Writing something like this with your width being more than 400 pixels and less than 1000 pixels is much more easy to understand than max width of this and min width of that, etc. So that's interesting. By the way, something that's not yet here, but that's feasible with specific libraries or polyfills are custom media queries. I use them a lot, and I'm trying to think of ways to make this available for you in custom CSS in the next version of OxyProps, the next major version of OxyProps, but I don't promise anything for that. Anchor positioning, that's a new feature from 2023. I've not used it. I think I know what it is. You know that you can position elements, and you can position elements absolutely. And when you position an element absolutely, it's positioned relative to the closest parent having a relative position. That's why often I tell you, or when you watch tutorials, you know that when you position something absolutely, you are told that you must think of giving a position relative to the parent. With anchor positioning, I think the idea is similar, but you define an anchor, any element, and you will position your element relative to this anchor. And if I'm not mistaken, I would need to check the specification, but I think you can define several anchors, and depending on the context, the algorithm will choose which of the anchor is the best for your global layout. That's the idea behind it. I haven't used it. I think I'm good with knowing what it is, but definitely that's something I need to explore. I will add it to my reading list. Okay, we are finished with layout. Let's go to shape and graphics. Okay, blend modes, background blend modes, isolation. Blend modes, I use it. Of course, it's used with overlays often. Isolation, I use it a lot. You know that you have an isolate class, which is often useful to create a new stacking context and having your z-index working as expected. Filters and effects, blur, brightness, contrast. Sure, I've used it, and you have filters available in the framework. You have filter properties and filter utility classes that many are used in combination with gradient for background, because you can combine gradients with noises and filters to achieve interesting visual effects. The backdrop filter, of course, I've used it. That's something that is commonly used in, how do we call that, in glass morphism design to get this frosted glass effect. For example, linear, that's an easing function. So this one, I know what it is, but I haven't used it. I use mainly Bezier curves as easing functions in the framework. So that's something I know that exists, but I haven't explored it a lot. I will add it to my reading list also. The intrinsic sizing, min content, max content, fit content, yes, of course, I've used it. These keywords are available on your OxyProps context menus. So directly from the context menus, you can define sizes as min content, max content, and fit content. That's usually the bottom line of your context menu. And what's this useful for? Well, you will tell the element to take as a size, usually as a width, the maximum content, the maximum width of its content. Min content will give the minimum width without breaking words, if it's a text content, and fit content will give you the best fit. Conic gradients, yes, of course, I've used it. You have conic gradients available in the framework, and not for Bricks user, but for Oxygen users, you have in the background image context menu, conic gradients, and also a blueprint that give you the blueprint function for creating a conic gradient that you can use and give it a try. View transition API, for sure, I've never used it. That's a new feature. I have to check this one. I think this is used to define transitions between page or element of a page, mainly when you work on a single page application. But that's definitely something I have to check because I cannot tell you much more right now. So I kind of know what it is, but haven't used it yet. If we look at the sample code, we can guess that we assign the property to an element, which is a figure here. And then we have pseudo elements that will define the old, which is the initial state and the final state, the new one, with a transform origin and an animation applied to the new state. So with the sample code, we kind of guess what it's doing. Let's go to colors. Okay, the color function. Colors are something really interesting. Okay, I've used it. I know what it is for sure. Maybe you don't know, but this exact example with the display P3, actually, that's a color function that uses a color definition for screen, for devices, with extended color range. So in OxyProps normalize, there are properties like this one. They are experimental, so you don't have much control over it, but it's used, and it's usually used together with an add support rule, which tests if your visitor's setting supports this color range, and use it in case it is supported. Okay, but color is interesting because it opens for very interesting things in the future. The accent color, yes, I've used it. That's part of OxyProps normalize. For example, the accent color allows you to redefine a lot of small details for HTML elements. For example, those checkboxes here can be styled. The color used for the checkbox can be styled using the accent color CSS property. But that's a radio button. That's not a checkbox, but this exact example here that allows you to redefine for form input or other elements the accent color. Current color, yes, that's a keyword. I've used it. I think that's part of your OxyProps color menu as a keyword. I will check. This allows to define a color as being the current text color in the context. Color mix, so we are entering color functions here. I've used it. This one is not part of the OxyProps framework. That's interesting. And if you look at the example, this allows to define a background color. And what's nice is that you can define a color space that you want to use. And inside of this color space, you want to mix white 20% with this hex code. And you will get as a background the resulting color. White gamut colors, that's something very interesting once it is supported by browsers. Currently, the best option we have to define the colors in CSS is using HSL. But one of the problems with HSL is that two colors with the same lightness parameter, lightness value, for example, a blue with a 50% lightness and a green with a 50% lightness, absolutely do not have the same human perceived lightness. A 50% lightness green will look much brighter than a 50% lightness blue. And those color space, and those are the ones I currently use, not directly in CSS, but using JavaScript libraries when defining color swatches in OxyProps, are color space that mimic the human perception. So once we are able to use OKLCH or OKLab inside of our CSS, we will be able to define colors that have the same perceived lightness when they have the same luminance component. Luminance being the first component here. So yes, I've used it, this one. Relative colors, these are advanced color functions. If you look at the example, you define a color and assign it to a CSS property. And then with an HSL function, you can destructure. I don't know if that's the term used in CSS. I'm using the one we usually use in JavaScript. You destructure your color into its H, S, and L component. So what this function does, it takes this color, splits the components, keeps the hue intact, the saturation intact, and multiplies the lightness by 1.2, and the resulting color will be lighter than the initial color. And this is interesting because you can do this transformation even if your initial color uses a different color space. Here that's hexadecimal notation, and you transform it to an HSL notation directly inside of your CSS. And the next one, interpolation color space. It's not the same idea, but it's still using a color space, and it will allow you to interpolate, that's the name, color space, and mix them in your definition. For example, here to define a gradient. So yes, I've used it. That's not as CSS, that's not part of the OxyProps framework, but of course these are concepts I'm really interested in and that are implemented today in OxyProps using JavaScript to generate colors. That's interesting because soon this will be directly visible inside of your style sheets. Interactions, scroll snaps with many properties, of course, I've used it. That's part of the OxyProps framework. You have utility classes to define your scrolling, snapping layout. And I have also a full build video using this technique. So if you look on the channel, you can find it in the portfolio build. Overscroll behavior, this one defines the scroll behavior. How to explain that? When you have an element that have overflow and imagine a long text inside of a block or a text area with a scroll bar. When you scroll this text area and reach the bottom of the area and you continue scrolling, then your page will continue scrolling. So you scroll your element and then at some point you reach the bottom and the page starts to scroll. So this overscroll behavior controls what you want to do when this happens. That's not part of OxyProps framework, but that's interesting to know. Touch action, well, that's quite straightforward. This defines if you allow touch actions or not on an element. Scroll behavior, auto or smooth, yes, I've used it. I think most of you use it. It's always nice to have a smooth scroll behavior directly from CSS. And this you can combine with the scroll padding that will define an offset from the anchor. And okay, we are at the bottom. The next is the scroll bar gutter. Well, the scroll bar gutter is a property that lets you define what should happen on your element. Sometimes you are visible scroll bars and they hide themselves. And when they become visible, they take a part of the available space on your screen, of course. And this scroll bar appearing or disappearing can create layout shifts. So with this property, you can define if you want to reserve space for your scroll bar. And if you do so, your layout will not change if the scroll bar appears or disappears. So that's the purpose of this CSS property. So yes, I've used it. I have a scroll bar utility classes in the framework. Not sure I have utility classes that control this property. I will add it to the reading list to give it a look. Typography, font display, font face. So font display is a property I don't use that much because I usually use CSS variable or CSS custom property to define a font stack, like the case in OxyProps with sans serif, monospace, and serif font stacks. But this property allows you to define a font as being a fallback font. Line clamps, yes, I've used it. And you have utility classes to control it in OxyProps. So for it to work, you need to define an overflow of hidden on the element. And then using these properties, you will define a number of lines that will be visible on your screen. And it's just a question of visibility because if you have a 10 lines text, only 2 lines will be visible, but when searching your page, the whole content will still be searchable. So it doesn't disappear from the DOM, it's just visually hidden. Variable fonts, I've used it. That's not part of OxyProps because the plugin is not managing fonts, except with the font stack that it uses the default system UI fonts from your website visitor. But variable fonts are fonts that within a single font file allow you to define several properties that will modify the visual aspect of your text. So here we have an example with the Frances font. That is a font that I like. You can find it on Google Fonts if you want to have a look. And being a Google font, it's probably available in Bricks or in Oxygen. Font palette, oh, that's a niche feature. Okay, I don't use it. because that's very specific. You need font families that will allow for using font palettes. Bungie, I don't know if you know this font. It's a font, I think it's designed by, I don't want to scratch his name. I think it's David Jonathan Ross from the DayGR Font Forge that designs very nice fonts. And Bungie is an open source project. And in this font project, he included, I think, each possible font property. So it's an experimental one. You can try a lot of things with the Bungie font family. And so with a font palette, you will define colors and a palette of colors for your font. Text wrap balance, you know what it is. You have in OxyProps framework text wrap utility classes. I had it in mind. I'm not sure I've added the text wrap balance one. I will check and add it if I haven't. But this is a property that defines what should happen when text needs to wrap inside the container. And balance is a keyword to let the algorithm keep something balanced. For example, if you have a heading extending on more than one line, it's usually not visually desirable to have only the last word wrapped on the next line. So text wrap balance will balance the content between the two lines, so you don't get isolated words on the last line. So I know what it is. I've used it a little. Yes, let's say I know what it is, but haven't used it. Accessibility next. Okay, so we are in media queries. Media prefers reduced motion. Okay, I've used it. This is part of OxyProps. All OxyProps animation classes, not properties that's up to you, how you use them, but classes. And transitions part of the style sheets and the normalized style sheet are wrapped inside a prefers reduced motion, no preference. That's a user setting in their browser. So some users that cannot, for different reasons, stand motion or animations will set this setting, and this indicates that you shouldn't allow animations on your site when this setting is set. So the way it is written here, it's positive way. But with background in safety topics, I prefer passive protections. So instead of writing it this way, and because this way suppose that you have an animation and you cancel it only if the user prefers reduce motion, so explicitly say that they don't want it. So let's say that you have an animation by default. In OxyProps, it's implemented the other way. By default, you have no animation, no transition. And then we have media queries with prefers reduce motion, no preference. And only if the user didn't set something, we will add the animation. Maybe you will think that's playing with details, but for those of you with knowledge about safety and risk prevention, you know that it's better to have it this way. Next one is the prefers color scheme. Of course, I've used it. OxyProps is built around color schemes and various color scheme preference. Prefers reduced data. Okay, I know what it is. I've used it. Once again, that's your website visitor settings. And this setting will define that your user, maybe they have a bad internet connection, maybe accessing the web is very expensive for them. Well, for any reason, they want to limit to the strict minimum the data downloaded from your website. So if this setting is active, you should avoid as much as possible downloading assets to your web page. That's the example here. We can imagine that the website uses a custom font and maybe a complex one, a variable font like we just saw, or a font supporting colors. And it's a very big file, maybe several hundred kilobytes. And if the user prefers reduced data, then the font family switched to System UI. So it will use the user's own system font and will not download any font from your servers. So that's interesting. With this setting and this kind of media query, you can avoid downloading unnecessary assets, unnecessary image that are not directly useful for understanding the content, fonts, or any other assets that could generate unnecessary data usage. Color schemes, yes, this allows to define at an element level which is the color scheme to use. I've used it, OxyProps light-dark toggle element, for example, with JavaScript, toggles the color scheme from light to dark on your page HTML element. And then the framework, based on the value of this attribute on your HTML element, will use the appropriate versions of the logical colors. Prefers contrast. Again, that's a media query. Some users, for many reasons, can need visually to have a reduced contrast or an increased contrast. For example, in OxyProps, you can define a dim color scheme, dim for diminished or reduced contrast. And if you decide to create it and to activate it in the plugin, then using this media query with a prefers contrast reduced, you can associate that with your dim color scheme. Forced colors, so that's an interesting one. For sure, I've used it. I'm not sure I can, without going to the documentation, give you the details, but some of your website visitors with visual impairments will activate the forced color options, and this forces specific colors. So you can define what you wish to display when a user activates these forced colors. Usually you want a design with very high contrast and well-defined borders and limits. For example, something with the forced color is that it forces color to the borders. So in OxyProps navigation custom elements, the menu bar element, for example, or the burger menu that were designed after the Y area suggested patterns, elements have a transparent border. And the purpose of this transparent border is that it's not visible for usual users, but when someone forces colors with this option, the borders become visible because forced color makes borders visible and highly contrasted. Focus visible, of course, I use it. It's used in OxyProps for keyboard navigation. For example, this is the pseudo class that defines the shape and the animation, and not exactly the animation, the transition on the outline. And as we just saw earlier, the transition only if prefers reduced motion is set to no preference. But then on the focus visible pseudo class, you have this outline appearing on keyboard navigation. So this is the pseudo class controlling focused element. That's for me the main use case. And actually, you see that that's the one used as an example. Other features, CSS variables, of course, I use them. OxyProps was completely built based on CSS variables. At supports, we talked about it earlier for, if you remember, the color function with the wide color range devices. So what this rule does is that it tests the visitor browser for support to specific CSS properties. So if this browser is able to display a table cell and to display a list item, then do this. CSS comparison, min, max, clump, of course, this is used for several things, but especially it's well known for fluid typography or fluid sizing. The add property rule, that's also an interesting one. You see that it goes with the CSS variables and it allows you to give more information about your CSS variable. In case, for example, you want to animate your CSS property, by default, the browser will not know if your property defines a text, a dimension, a color, or anything. So it will not be able to animate it. With this rule, you can define what it is. For example, this example defines our property as being a color. And as it is defined as being a color, now we will be able to transition or to animate this property. That's what it's used for. The marker pseudo element allows you to give additional styles to your list, for example, the li marker. And this way you can replace the default disk by a fancy star. The has selector, that's a very interesting one. It's sometimes being referred to as the parent selector, because if we take this example, we have a element, so it's a link, an anchor that has as a direct child an image tag. So if you have several A tags, several anchors on your page, but some contain text and other ones contains images, the following rule will only apply to the ones containing images as a direct descendant. So this cannot be used as utility classes because it will really depend on specific case, but in your custom CSS or in your custom class definition or defining custom pseudo elements in Bricks, for example, custom states, you will be able to use it this way. The where pseudo class, I use it a lot. So we have two pseudo classes. We have is and where. They are similar, but they are not the same. If we look at it, it will allow us to group elements. We could say when our element is a header or a main or a footer. And this is if we read it where our element is a header, a main, or a footer. It's similar. The only difference will be the specificity of our selector. The is, colon is, selector will take the specificity of the highest specificity selector inside of it. So in this case, those are all elements. So the is header, main, footer would have a specificity of 001. And if you are not familiar with the specificities, tell me in the comments, but I have on my to-do list the fact to create a video about selector specificity. So I will probably do that. And when we wrap it in a where pseudo class like this, it still will select header, main, and footers, but with a specificity of 0, meaning that this doesn't increase specificity and can be overridden very easily. So most of the rules in OxyProps are using the where pseudo class, so they have a 0 specificity, making things easy for you as a user to define a different style and not having to fight against the framework. CSS layers, I've used it, and honestly, I'm more than considering, I've already implemented in my development version of OxyProps version 2. My only concern is that it will be supported by OxyProps, but the builders we are using the plugin with do not support cascade layers. But the idea behind cascade layers is that you define layers of CSS with priorities. And for example, we could imagine we are working with a page builder, we are working with Oxygen, or we are working with Bricks. And Bricks generated CSS as a Bricks CSS layer, which would be the first level with the lower priority. Then you decide to integrate a framework, OxyProps or another framework you choose, or your own one. And you would create a second layer that will be your framework layer. And this would have an higher priority over the builder layer. And then you can have a third layer. And actually anything that's defined outside of a defined layer is on this top layer with the highest priority. And what's interesting is that the rule with the lowest specificity in a higher priority layer will always override a rule with high specificity, but with a lower layer. I hope what I say is understandable. But for example, maybe you know that when you apply a style to an ID, it has higher priority than a style applied to an element. Well, with CSS layers, if I have a Bricks layer applying a style to an ID, and then I have my user layer on top of that, when I apply a style to an element, for example, to a paragraph, my style will always have priority over a style defined by Bricks at the paragraph ID level. Okay, that's all the interest of cascade layers. Shadow DOM features, I've used it, so I'm not using it in OxyProps. I'm using it with other frameworks I use. You're probably familiar with your DOM, the structure of your document. And maybe you know or you don't know that you can create custom HTML elements. We have in this code example, we have a custom element here. So imagine we have created a custom element with our own custom HTML tag. And this element can be a complex one and can have its own HTML structure. And we don't want to pollute the main document, the main DOM, with this element structure. We just want it to appear with the tag of custom element in our HTML structure. But this element will have its own structure, its own DOM, and that's called the shadow DOM, or sometimes the ghost DOM. So we have pseudo elements and pseudo class that allow us to target specific aspects of this shadow DOM. The trigonometric functions, sinus, cosinus, tangent, these are mathematical functions used. I'm not sure I use them in OxyProps framework. Maybe I've used them in one of my videos. I don't remember, but I think when we recreated a moving gradient trying to mimic the stripe hero section, we use trigonometric functions, not sure. CSS nesting, okay, native CSS nesting, of course I use this either in Sass or in PostCSS or any preprocessor. And this is coming to the browser, which is very nice. Image sets, so this is not part of OxyProps, but I know what it is, I've used it. This allows you to define, you have a background image, and then maybe you are familiar with source set, because your page builder is probably generating a source set for your images with the different custom or default WordPress or custom image sizes that you have defined. And that's the same idea. You will define your image set and give a URL to a file with a screen with a pixel density of 1 and a different one for screens having a pixel density of 2. So this allows you to take into consideration, for example, retina displays or displays like that. The image function, okay, I know what it is. I've not used it a little. From memory, this is not a replacement, but an addition. This is similar to the URL function you are probably used to call a background image using URL and then giving the path to your image. Well, this one is similar, but gives additional properties. For example, this image has X, Y, and W and H properties. So you can imagine what this is. X and Y is defined a point. So this is a focal point inside of our image that will be at coordinates 0, 20 for X and Y. And then it defines a width and a height. So it will, in some way, it's similar. What was the object property we had at the beginning? It allows you to crop your image. So you define a central point and then a width and a height around this point. I'm not sure if it's the central point or if it is the top left corner. We would need to check. But this is a nice way if you have a background image and that you want, depending, it can be interesting associated with media queries. If you have a background image, but depending on the screen size, you want to crop a specific part of your image, well, you can use this CSS property with the appropriate media queries. Individual transform properties, I love it. Instead of having to remember the order of the transform properties, it's much more simple to give a translate, a rotate, and a scale instead of having to wrap all of this inside of the transform function. Okay, the rest of the survey is about opinions about CSS framework and CSS in JS framework and tools. I'm not sure I will give you my personal opinion about these tools. It's better if you want to have your own. Just maybe you see that OpenProps is part of the list. Of course, you can imagine that I have a very good opinion on OpenProps because I use it and I use it as the core of OxyProps. So this one I can tell you I use it and I will use it again. But I will stop here for the video. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned things. If you have comments and specific things you would like to discuss, please tell me in the comment. Take the survey for yourself. Subscribe to the channel, give a like to the video, and I'll see you in the next video.